Okay, here we go. We are live. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Philosophy Friday. We're going to have a roundtable discussion on Aquinas's five ways, his metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, and I've got the dream team here with me, folks. I'm really excited for this conversation. Dr. Gavin Kerr, who's become somewhat of the resident philosopher on the Pat Flynn Show, is back again. We always love having him. And a relatively new guest and a relatively new friend of mine, Carlo Broussard. We recently had a conversation, but there's a chance, Carlo, that people may actually hear this one first. So before we start diving into the main topic today, I'd love to just revisit some introductions from both of you, either for new listeners or Carlo, if they don't hear our previous conversation. I'd love for you to just take a minute or two to introduce yourself. And then Gavin, same with you as well. But let's start with you, Carlo.
Yeah, so I am an apologist and speaker, full-time here, staff apologist and speaker at Catholic Answers, a religious, nonprofit religious organization dedicated to defending and explaining all things Catholic. We have a variety of ministries, outlets here, live radio, magazine, both online and print. We have a press, we have a studios department. So we're constantly cranking out products on a variety of different topics. We have a speaking ministry, so I travel along with other colleagues around the country, giving lectures and talks on a variety of different topics of the Catholic faith. As for me, personally, I come from a music background in southern Louisiana, playing the Cajun accordion, so you just Google that and check that out. Grew up playing in the bars since the time I was 13, pursuing a musical career in my late teens, about 18 years old. And when I was about 20, I gave up my pursuit for a musical career to do that full time in southern Louisiana in order to pursue theology and philosophy because our Lord got a hold to me. I became attracted to theology and philosophy through the ministry of now my boss here at Catholic Answers, Tim Staples. I had heard his conversion story about how he was a former anti-Catholic, sought to debunk the Catholic faith, and ended up becoming Catholic and one of the nation's leading Catholic evangelists and apologists. And I heard his story when I was about 18 and got attracted to apologetics, was introduced to apologetics for the first time, the science of defending the Christian faith, right? And I sort of fell in love with the Lord, became convicted in my Catholic faith, and that faith grew stronger. And eventually I came to the point in my life where I was so attracted to apologetics that I thought, man, I'd like to do this for a living, as probably everybody else thinks when they get into apologetics, right? Everybody wants to do apologetics for a living. And so Tim Staples befriended me and sort of tugged me along the rope for several years and always said, one day we'll work together. And so about 4.5 years ago, that dream finally came true, and I was able to come on board here at Catholic Answers. In the meantime, I pursued some degrees. I got my undergraduate and graduate degrees in theology, as well as a master's in philosophy, and just constantly an informal student and learning all the time. And so I have a beautiful wife, 16 and a half years, almost 17 years now in August that I'm a husband to a beautiful wife, Jacqueline. And we have 5 wonderful children ranging from ages 15 to 2. And we live here in Southern California. So that's kind of, in short, my backstory, coming from a music career. And so from the bandstand to the Bible in my hand, I guess.
I love it. No. So what excites me about this conversation is not, we're all Catholic, obviously, if that isn't already out of the bag. But we all love philosophy. We also all love music and working out as well. So there's probably a lot of other topics we could jam around on. But
our gyms finally opened.
Yeah, finally. It's awesome.
I am sore as get out, man. I can't even lift my arms.
That's good. How about you, Gavin, over in Ireland? Are the gyms open around? Have you been training at home, or what have you been doing for your workout routine?
Yeah. So the wife and I, we've been training at home. The gyms aren't open yet, but I mean, we train at home anyway. We do the Insanity program. We do powerlifting. We do kind of real sort of a lot of conditioning work and stuff. During lockdown over here, I installed an outdoor pull-up bar, which has kind of a bracket on it for a punch bag. Got myself a punch bag set, just to do the martial arts, against the bag at home. And Yeah, so we've been doing that. So a lot of cardio conditioning, some weights. The powerlifting's taken a bit of a back seat since we did a lot of that in the autumn, and so now we're working on a bit of conditioning. And then I've just been, working on the martial arts. I was all set to, do the next grading in the Kung Fu just before lockdown, and then lockdown kicked in. So I need to kind of stay on top of that, just, for whenever I go back, we can get the grading done.
Right. Yeah. It's been an interesting situation, to be sure, but I know we're all trying to make the most of it. So real quick, Gavin, this is probably our sixth or seventh time dragging you on this podcast. Always so grateful that you share your time with us. A bit of a backstory, history of your own, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my name's Gavin. I'm from Ireland. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland. I'm a married father of three. I've been married for 15 years, so not as long as Karlo there, but married for 15 years, 2005. I've known my wife since 1999, so just over 20 years now. We've been together, so I was around about 15. She was 16 when we got together. I have three children. A girl is number one, so she's the eldest, and two boys, so the girl's the boss. I've got a cat and a dog as well. And we live in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I'm a philosopher, theologian. All my degrees formally are in philosophy, but given the sort of philosophy that I work on, there's that kind of crossover into theology. And I currently teach at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. I'm a lecturer in philosophy. Prior to St. Patrick's College, I was teaching theology at Mary Immaculate College. And I've just always kind of worked on medieval philosophy and theology, ancient philosophy, modern philosophy in the form of Descartes, Hume, Kant, and contemporary analytic philosophy, especially the foundations of analytic philosophy. Thematically speaking, I'm interested in metaphysics, epistemology, logic, and more now as I get older, getting more and more interested in ethics and sort of applying all the stuff from more theoretical philosophy into ethics. Written two books. We'll publish two books. On Aquinas, the first one, Aquinas' Way to God, and the second one, Aquinas and the Metaphysics of Creation. And then just a lot of different articles here and there. Yeah, well, there's Pat has book number 2.
That's right, right there. I was just brushing up before the conversation.
I just finished it 2 days ago, by the way. Excellent book, man.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah,
that was good to hear.
Yeah, really tremendous work. And Gavin's underselling himself. He's a brilliant philosopher, incredible Thomist. It's always a joy to have him on. And so let me lay out what I think the general structure of this conversation, I think, will be, and then we'll get your guys' input and we'll start to dive in here. And for people who are new to philosophy, metaphysics, natural theology, our plan is to start off in the shallow end, and then we'll probably get more technical as we go along. So I think this should hopefully be at least initially accessible to a lot of people. And we're going to talk about arguments for the existence of God, and these have they're personal to me because I think you two are both you were both kind of cradle Catholics more or less. I know Karlo, you had a sort of a deepening of your conversion experience from what I understand. I fell away from religion for a very long time. My kind of introduction to philosophy was with the old atheists and existentialists. And it wasn't until much later when I discovered not just Aquinas, but Plato, Aristotle, the ancient and medieval philosophers that I started to really change my mind. And I started to think, well, maybe I've got some things wrong, and maybe not just the small things, maybe some of the broad strokes I've gotten wrong. And over time, as I continued to study these great thinkers, Aquinas, of course, being the most significant one, I became convinced that these arguments are essentially correct. And ultimately, it brought me, and not just me, but my wife as well, and our entire family into the Catholic faith, seeing that, reason. I love the way my friend Tim McGrew once put it. He says, reason converges on Christianity, and in Christianity completes reason. I'm like, that's it. That's exactly it. So we're going to talk about the 5 ways specifically, because these are famous or infamous, I guess you could say. They're a subject of tremendous contemporary discussion and debate, not just over whether they're successful, but also how best to interpret them as well. Right. And I think we're going to argue that they are successful. And I think we're also going to argue that they deserve an existentialist interpretation. And maybe we'll explain what all that means as we go along. So that's my introduction. But what I'd love to hear from the two of you, just starting out, of what of what you think the hook is or the value of studying not just Aquinas, but metaphysics and natural theology. Why should people do this? What is the fruit that they can reap from this? And what is, any personal insights that you would want to share about that? So why don't we go Gavin first this time, and then we'll head to you, Karlo.
Yeah. Always when studying metaphysics and speaking to students and trying to sell metaphysics to students, over here it's a 12-week semester, and very soon you kind of go off the deep end in metaphysics and you get into some really abstract stuff that can just drive students nuts. So I always think we need to sell this sort of stuff to students to let them know that it's important, so they can at least live off that selling point whenever they do go off the deep end and they wonder, what are we doing with all this? And I always find the best way to do this is to go back to the ancient Greeks, to the pre-Socratics and to Plato. And there's two things to note in the pre-Socratics and Plato that I think really helps us get a feel for why metaphysics is important. The first is, it's a story about Thales. Thales is, known to be referred to as the first philosopher, and it's a story about his death. Thales, when he was walking along, he was consumed with interest at the stars, and he didn't see the well in front of him, and he fell down the well and died. And there were nearby these milkmaids saw him fall down the well, and they thought this was hilarious. They didn't go to help, but they thought this was hilarious, and that how could somebody be so stupid as to not see what was right before them? But the irony is that Thales, it was precisely because he was not stupid, that he was not an idiot, that he was considering the heavens, let's say, the higher things, that he missed what was right in front of him. He missed the here and now because he was taking a more universal viewpoint. And you get something similar in Plato's Myth of the Cave and the Republic. It's probably the most famous story in Plato, but if anybody doesn't know it, the idea is that there's these prisoners in the cave that have been there from birth. They're looking at the wall in the cave behind them, and there's a kind of a fire behind them, and their captors are parading objects from the outside world back and forth in front of that fire. So all the prisoners see are the shadows, and they start to get an idea that the shadows are the real world. And then a prisoner escapes from the cave, and he gets out of the cave and he's dazzled by the light, and he has to kind of go back in, and then gradually he has to expose himself to the light until he can see everything in the full light of day. And during that gradual exposure, he starts to realize that the reality of objects outside the cave is much richer. There's much more to it. It's more luminous than the reality that's inside the cave. So much so that he just could not think of going back to the cave and reverting to his former life within the cave. But when he does go back and try to free the prisoners in the cave, they think he's an idiot. They kill him for his services. And now Plato's point there is, well, that's Socrates. That's what happened to Socrates. Socrates kind of escaped the cave of everydayness, and he kind of, engaged with that wonder about reality, and he tried to bring this illumination to the people of Athens, to certain people in Athens, and they killed him. They executed him for his troubles. There's something similar in the story of Thales and then Plato's Myth of the Cave, and it's this. Whenever we become consumed with wonder about the deep reality of things, we start to overlook the here and now, the everyday, so much so that the everyday is unimportant. We find philosophers, metaphysicians especially, aloof to the everyday. We could very easily fall down the well which is right in front of us, but that's because in order to think things through about the being of things, about the reality of things, we need to kind of abstract from the everydayness, transcend it in a certain way, and think about that without which there wouldn't be the everyday, which is right in front of us. And there's something in that which answers to a kind of a desire of the human heart or of the human intellect, which Aristotle articulates in the first line of the Metaphysics, that by nature all men desire to know. We have this desire to know. Our intellect is like a stomach. If you don't feed it, it gets sick, and you get hunger pangs and everything. So you need to constantly be feeding it with knowledge. And there is something about reality, about the being of things, the very realness of things being there, which prompts, which draws our wonder and prompts us to investigate it. And that's what Thales, the pre-Socratics, that's what Plato was after. And that's what we do in metaphysics. We're kind of leaving that cave, and when things get dazzling and stuff like that's just us acclimating to a kind of a metaphysical way of thinking about things. And you kind of have to just trust in the process and realize that once you get to the end of it, you wouldn't want to go back to life in the cave. Life in the cave kind of, is situated then, and it's illuminated by our knowledge of life outside the cave. So that's kind of how I pitch things to my first year philosophy students.
Right. And so really you're just saying be careful, because once you get into it, there's no getting out. And how true that is, right? Like once you get a taste for it, it becomes an obsession. But it's I think it's something that we would argue is one of those healthy obsessions. Must be tempered, of course, with other priorities in life as well, right? But it's a very fruitful obsession. So Karlo, what would you add to anything that Gavin said?
Yeah, that was excellent. I must say, I immediately started reflecting upon my own daily experience of constantly having to draw my attention back to the immediate, of focusing on my wife and my kids, because my mind is wanting to read Gavin's book, right? And so I have to constantly reorient myself and try to intellectually resituate the immediate within the context of the universal, right? And say, okay, how can the philosophy and my training in philosophy help me now be a better husband and a better father to my kids? So that was the first thing that thought, like, it's a daily thing. You constantly wanting to extend to the universal, but due to daily responsibilities, having to focus on the immediate. Gavin, you brought up a very important point, the first line of the Metaphysics, every man desires to know. So like, why metaphysics? Why philosophy? It's for the sake of being human, right? It's for the sake of fulfilling our potential as a human being and do what we as humans do, namely to wonder and come to know reality, which is the essence of sanity, right? So I think the bottom line here is, we want to be sane. We want to have sanity, which is, as Frank J. Sheed often put it, sanity is to know what is real and to live in accord with what is real. Yeah. And that's what metaphysics does, right? It gives us reality. It paints for us the framework or the picture, the universe of reality itself, in order that we can live within it and live in harmony with it. And at the end of that philosophical inquiry and that metaphysical inquiry, as you pointed out, Gavin, we come to that source of being, right? And that once again ties into who and what we are as human beings. And first of all, recognizing that that source of being is the source from which we come, our very being comes. And as Gavin, you put it, without which we would not be. So that inspires a sense of gratitude within us to orient our lives to this source of being in the sense of worshiping the creator, right? But also, and I'm going to just do a pitch here for Gavin's new book on metaphysics of creation, how, Gavin, you beautifully draw out in your book of how, what is the efficient cause, right? The thing that's giving the essay, giving the existence to us, right? For which we're grateful. But that first cause being also the ultimate life's goal that we're all directed to in order to, in which we find our ultimate complete human satisfaction and human fulfillment. So first and foremost, philosophy is important, and especially metaphysics, in order to know the ultimate source of reality and to give honor where honor is due to that creator. We call it worship, but also to direct our lives to that ultimate reality so that we can experience the authentic human happiness that we so long for. So it's God first, and then also for our own human happiness.
Yeah, this is excellent. Everything just said, I'm just going to concur with it and move on, because I don't want to diminish any of the brilliance here. But I'll diminish it a little bit, right? Because I can't help but add how true this is, right? Is that, like, there are consequences to doing this, and certainly I would argue there's consequences to doing it either well or poorly. If you do it well, I think the consequences are very good, because you're going to arrive at the conclusions that have already been hinted at. God not only exists, but he is not the reason. He's not just the reason for our existence. He's also the source of our ultimate fulfillment, right? And that's going to bring up a whole bunch of other questions, right? A whole bunch of other questions that philosophy can answer somewhat, but eventually we're going to have to cross over to the theological as well. So philosophy can be a bridge there. to invite the religious questions, which is very important. Separate conversation from this one, but can definitely lead you there as it did me. And then that can radically transform your life. And I know it's radically transformed all of ours in different ways. So there are real life, we're not just sitting in the ivory tower, right? There's real life practical consequences to this. Very fruitful, very good, big meaning of life stuff. So
yeah,
let's
one of my good
ahead.
friends, Pat from Louisiana, he studies theology and philosophy as well, and we talk all the time. And I remember him saying one time, the reason why I study theology and philosophy is to be a better husband and a better father, right? And then ultimately, from a Christian perspective, to be a better son of the Father and a better brother of Jesus, better servant of Jesus, right? So I think that sort of encapsulates the whole project of philosophy.
Well, as I'm sure we'll touch on once you get to the fifth way, is we all want to know what the good life is. Well, first off, if there is a such thing as the good life. If not, then I guess the only question is, why do we seem so deluded, right? But if yes, then what is it? Can we know it? Can we actually live it or achieve it? So we will in part be trying to answer that, I suppose, in today's conversation. And as Gavin hinted earlier, I think once you kind of get the metaphysical structure, this is going to impinge on or lead to ethical consequences as well, on not just what we're living for, but giving us some idea of the means of how best to achieve that as well. Okay, so let's set this out. Gavin, I'm going to kick it back over to you. Let's make no assumptions. Maybe this is the first time anybody's heard of Aquinas. Maybe this is the first time they've ever heard of the five ways. What are we going to be talking about? What are the sort of introductory remarks? And then we can just start jamming around.
Yeah, so just by way of introduction, the five ways, they appear in the Summa Theology, right in the first part of the Summa Theology. It's not the first question of the Summa Theology, it's the second question. And Aquinas, in the first question, is kind of just setting up what the science of theology is. And its subject matter is going to be God. And then in the second question, Thomas is asking, well, how do we know that subject matter actually exists? This isn't going to get off the ground unless we can establish that subject matter exists. So the second question is considering that, whether God exists. And it's not until the third article of the second question that Aquinas actually sets out the five ways. Preceding that, he wants to know whether or not God's existence is self-evident, and whether or not it's demonstrable. So he's considering issues which, are pertinent to us today, because some people, I'm thinking of the Reformed epistemologists, they think, well, God's existence is self-evident. I have warrant for believing in God because I've had an experience of God in my life, and that warrants belief in that. That's not the sort of thing that Aquinas is engaged in. Obviously, Aquinas will think, well, good for you, you've had an experience of God, great. But we want God as a subject matter of a science, publicly accessible to anybody. Even somebody who hasn't had that experience of God should still be able to do this science of theology. And so he's going to want proper demonstration of God's existence, which is why in the second article to that question, he considers whether it is even possible to demonstrate God's existence, given his whole notion of the logic of demonstration. And that's a really important article that a lot of people overlook. We need to consider how it is that we can demonstrate something before we actually get into the demonstrations. Most textbooks, most introductory texts on the five ways just go straight to the five ways themselves, read them very poorly, if at all, and then just move on. Whereas Thomas has a whole sort of system of a whole logic of demonstration, which he takes and develops from Aristotle, which is, key to interpreting these five ways. And then you get the five ways themselves, which we'll talk through, and we'll go through kind of each way, what it springboards from, what it takes as its starting point, the important points about the denial of infinite regress and all of that.
Right. So real quick, Gavin, if you don't mind, just for people who might be new to the conversation, when we say demonstration, or when we, even because sometimes you'll hear the word proof, when we say proof for the existence of God, what exactly do we mean by that? Because this obviously, I think, can lead to some unnecessary initial confusion if we don't clear that up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so I'll give an example. This is an example I tend to use with my students. All my students accept that they are mortal, okay? They accept that they will die someday. And I ask them, well, can you prove to me that you will die? Now, there's a very easy proof that any one of my students could give there and then, but I wouldn't want them to give that proof, and it would be to take their own lives. Now, I don't want, that's one way of proving it, but is there any other way of proving that they're mortal? And so there's a classic argument. It's called by Aristotle the syllogism, but it's a form of argumentation, and it goes as follows. And Socrates is it's Socrates' mortality that we're demonstrating, but it could be anybody's mortality. And the argument goes: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And what that does, and now that's a demonstration of Socrates' mortality, and I could run for any one of us. You could demonstrate my mortality by that. What it does is that you have three terms in that argument. You have man, mortality, and Socrates. The term man is found in both the premises. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, but it's not found in the conclusion. The conclusion is Socrates is mortal. What that term man does, that's called the middle term. It connects the other two terms together. When we say that all men are mortal, we're predicating something of mankind in general. And then in the next premise, when we say Socrates is a man, we're saying Socrates is one of those things about which we have affirmed something in the first premise. So that in the conclusion, we can justifiably draw that conclusion that Socrates is mortal. Now that's, I'm willing to say that's a waterproof, airtight demonstration of the mortality of Socrates or me or anybody else. The question then is, I mean, how do we know the premises are true? And so you have all sorts of arguments to establish the truth of the premises. But that's the kind of framework of demonstration of demonstrative proof that Aquinas is working with, is that syllogism.
Right. So just to be clear, what we're going to be doing is arguing deductively. So if the premises are true, we can have certitude of the conclusion just by the canons of logic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Gavin, Gavin,
yeah.
I think it would be great if you could touch a little bit on the kind of certainty that we can have with the conclusion, namely God exists, with these five ways, because as you know, Gavin and Pat, many within contemporary conversations about the existence of God, some, there's a spectrum of positions as to the nature of the certainty. Some might fall on the side of, well, it's probable knowledge. Aquinas, I would argue, clearly thinks is demonstrative knowledge.
Yeah.
But what does that entail? And that is to say, does Aquinas think that the premises upon which his conclusion, namely God exists, are based, can they be reduced to first principles of both knowledge and being that we cannot possibly deny? So, and if those premises can be reduced to first principles, like the principle of non-contradiction, something cannot both be and not be in the same respect, same place and time. If those premises can eventually be reduced to those first principles that we cannot possibly deny, then that would give us what philosophers call a metaphysical certainty with the conclusion. Would you agree with that? Is there anything you can say about that?
I would qualify that somewhat. I agree that we do have metaphysical certainty with regard to these proofs. But I hold that some of the premises are empirical premises. They're empirical observations about the world. But in making those empirical premises, we see in the premises certain metaphysical truths which we use in deducing the conclusion. So, I mean, when we get to the first way, for instance, it's the observation that there's motion in the world. That's an empirical premise that we have to go with. Now, it's innocuously true. It's just self-evidently true that there is motion in the world. One would be foolish to deny that. So somebody like Parmenides, even Parmenides realizes, there's motion, but he has to come up with some really extravagant way of explaining away motion. So there are those sorts of premises involved in the proof, such that they begin from the world, but in beginning from the world, they look at sort of the metaphysical features of the world and then arrive at their conclusion. I don't think, and I know some philosophers, some Thomists have held this, I don't think those premises are ultimately reducible to self-evident first principles. I do think some self-evident first principles like law of identity, non-contradiction are involved in the reasoning, but I think we need to feed in empirical premises to that reasoning in order to get out
Right. Yeah. So my position is
the conclusion that we have.
Yeah, I would. I certainly, I think, agree with everything that Gavin said, and I'm kind of developing my thought on this, especially after you sent me that stuff from Garrigou, Karlo. Um, yeah, I would always say that at the least you could defend the premises by way of reductio or retorsion. That if you're going to deny this, you're going to be led into a pretty incoherent point of view. And if that's where you want to live your life, like, go for it, right? Because I don't think people are going to really want to be, because anything else that people want to affirm, especially if they're very skeptical but still a fan of science, like, you're going to need to grant this to have the science thing too, right? So, to me, these arguments, whether they can be reduced to first principles or not, they have an extremely, extremely high price tag for their denial, is the way where I'm at. And that price tag is going to be more than I think anybody can reasonably bear, in good faith or goodwill. But I would love to return to this point as we move forward for each of that, once we get into the specifics, and maybe jam on that as well. And I've been thinking a lot more about the kind of a priori demonstrations, the ontological arguments again, because Aquinas famously rejected those, but there's some interesting new developments on those fronts too, coming from like Proust and Rasmussen, like from possible causes to provide the symmetry breaker for the modal ontological argument. So I'm thinking we got some other tools in the kit as well that are pretty interesting in development. There's a lot of just cool stuff happening in theistic philosophy right now in general, but for another conversation perhaps. So Karlo, anything else you wanted to say about that, or should we start diving into the 5 ways?
No, I was just saying, I think, Gavin, you made an important point that you have those empirical premises there, right? And then it would seem to me that once you grant that we can trust our senses and that what we sensibly perceive is real, then once you begin the reasoning process, then those premises in that reasoning process, it would seem to me, can eventually be reduced to a denial of first principles. So when we get with the principle of causality, whatever is moved by another type thing. If you deny that, well, then you end up in a contradiction, right? It would seem to me. And in that sense, it's those premises being reduced to first principles. And so you can have scientific knowledge in the conclusion, or demonstrative knowledge, as Aquinas puts it. And then, the issue with sensory observation, I mean, of course, anybody who wants to poke at the 5 ways could try to destroy that bridge, right? That bridge of trusting the senses. And so, that's a bit of a philosophical task as well, to try to defend the trustworthiness of our senses, and that what we're taking in is real,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think sort of those Thomas, say somebody like Garrigou Lagrange, that would want to sort of reduce the premises to ultimate first principles. They have in mind sort of philosophical opponents, the rationalists, people who would maybe question the our dependence on sensory experience. The way I sort of see things is that there's when you do metaphysics, you presuppose an epistemology. There's an epistemological kind of framework in place. You need to do something first, and so you do the metaphysics, and if somebody questions your epistemology, well, you dive into the epistemology and you deal with that. And so if it's the idea is kind of like, well, if there's, show me where the itch is and I'll scratch it, and we'll deal with that as it comes up. So yeah, I mean, Aquinas is presupposing epistemic realism,
right,
in the 5 ways, and it's a presupposition which he defends elsewhere, and we can give a defense of that.
Cool. Well, why don't we just kind of like, we'll consider objections towards the end, so then maybe we can circle back around to some of the more technical objections like that and see how they can be dealt with. I was revisiting some of the wonderland, often the pseudo-philosophical wonderland of YouTube, some of the 5 ways videos on there, and it is amazing how frequently misunderstood the 5 ways are. So I want this to be the definitive conversation, right? Like after this conversation, nobody should make these mistakes with the 5 ways ever again. This is going to be it. We're putting it to rest, right?
Other Thomists are going to have a time with that statement.
Right. This is
and
going
much
to be
more beyond the boundaries of Thomists, right?
Yeah.
Philosophers in general.
Both their success and their interpretation. This is the end all be all. There needs to be no more discussion after this conversation, aside from Gavin's next book. Maybe that's it. So, I want kind of want to like get right into it, but at the same time, like, why do you think people often miss some of the most crucial distinctions and elements of the five ways, Gavin, either whether it's YouTube videos or Dawkins and the God delusion? Is it because they're so terse and they're just reading them in isolation without the background metaphysics? What's your diagnosis of the general problem? I think you'd probably agree that most people just severely misunderstand them, at least on the popular level, right?
Yeah, unless it's a professional philosopher with an interest in Thomism and medieval philosophy, generally presentations of the five ways are pretty poor, and they just get things wrong. This is because the five ways are usually just read in that single article by themselves. The person presenting it doesn't have a background in Thomism, doesn't understand Aquinas' say epistemic realism, his principles of demonstration, what he means by demonstration, and they just simply present the five ways and leave it at that. And there's so much packed into the five ways that the person who isn't a scholar is unable to unpack it, and so just doesn't get what's going on there. So I don't like to name any living philosophers, but when I kind of started on the wonderful world of teaching philosophy, I was, adjuncting on a course, and we were doing philosophy of religion, and there was a book, one of the textbooks, and I'm not going to name because it's a living philosopher, and I don't like to kind of, name people like that unless it's in publication. And he said, so Aquinas reasons X, Y, and Z, and then concludes, therefore God exists. And with my tutorial group, with my seminar group of this, I kind of just had to say, look, that's just wrong. I'm sorry. We're going to actually look at what he says. Because at no point, even in that conclusion, therefore God exists, at no point does Thomas say that in any of the five ways. At no point does he say that. And that's just one thing. But the philosopher just presented it, pretty poorly. The worst is when we get to the third way, maybe, or the fifth way. Because the third way, I saw a presentation of the third way from somebody who isn't a Thomist, a contemporary analytic philosopher. He saw Thomas talking about necessity and contingency, or possibility and necessity, and he says, right, well, what Aquinas means here is that a necessary being is a being that exists in all possible worlds, and a contingent being, or a possible being, is a being that exists in only some possible worlds. And I had to approach this guy after the class and says, no, that's wrong, because for Aquinas, there are necessary beings which don't exist in all possible worlds, such as the planets. Now, Aquinas is just wrong in his physics there, but you can't, say that Aquinas thinks this is what necessity is when that's not what necessity is. The fifth way, just presented as another version of a Paleite design argument. Completely wrong, completely, misinterpretation. All they see is teleology, and they think, right, design argument. So that's how we classify it. So there just seems to be a lot of impatience with reading Aquinas from the outset. And because Aquinas is a voluminous writer, a systematic writer, like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, it takes an awful lot to unpack their thinking. You almost have to master the system yourself. And if you're just wanting to write a chapter or an introduction to the five ways, or just do a video on the five ways, you don't have time to master the thinking of another philosopher. So yeah, I think there are just some of the conditions which, would explain why treatment is pretty bad. What do you think, Conor?
No, I agree 100%. Not only does that explain why so many people get it wrong, but it also explains why so many people avoid the five ways in contemporary presentations for evidence for God and tend to focus on more probabilistic arguments, such as the fine-tuning argument, which would somewhat of a Paley design type argument, right? Where you have sort of probable reasoning without trying to have a demonstration like I would argue St. Thomas's five ways are, because it requires so much metaphysical background. You have to know the metaphysical framework in which the five ways are being presented, because of all of the metaphysical principles that are driving the five ways, right? And this is why it's extremely difficult to teach a seminar at a parish, at a Catholic parish, or church or something on the five ways.
And not only that, Karlo, but they're like awful apologetically, honestly. Like I almost never use the five ways apologetically in conversation, because you have to unpack so much metaphysics to really get them across that, like, in like an everyday conversation, the chances of you really, like, what I say is you study the five ways because you want to understand reality. because you're really interested in this. You're not trying to win an argument with somebody. I think there's other, if you're just, trying to get points across or trying to be persuasive in an argument, I can't think of even one instance where I've used the 5 ways. Now, maybe that's just a deficiency on my part, but I just find them, but they're my favorite. Like I'm with both of you guys. Like, I think these are demonstrative proofs. They not only give us knowledge that God exists, but they can tell us a whole heck of a lot about God's nature as well. That some of these other probabilistic arguments, or I would even argue the Kalam argument, they just can't, right? They really can't. They might be able to get you to some necessary being or uncaused cause, but they definitely don't get you pure actuality or anything like that. So that's kind of like an interesting dilemma, I guess, for all of us. And I don't know if you guys agree with that or disagree with that. I mean, Karlo, you do full-time apologetics work. Where do you see the 5 ways just from like the Catholic Answers standpoint?
Yeah, there is a distinction to be drawn between arguments that might achieve or might be successful for the sake of evangelization, initially speaking, versus arguments that carry the weight at the end of the day, right? So at the end of the day, it's Aquinas' 5 ways or variants of the 5 ways that utilize the same principles that's going to be victorious at the end of the day and carry the weight and not going to sell you short. But it's just going to be a long journey to get there. But for evangelistic purposes, for example, if you have somebody who's really scientifically inclined, which a lot of people in our contemporary culture are, and they have no clue about the metaphysical principles underlying the 5 ways, it might be wise and prudent to at least start in conversation with an individual with something like the Kalam argument and employing contemporary evidence from contemporary cosmology in order to show that at least, and also the fine-tuning argument, to show someone that at least you would have good reason to think that a creator who is intelligent exists. It might not give you demonstrative knowledge that such a creator with intelligence exists, but at least it could show that one would be credible in making that conclusion, right? And so within contemporary philosophy, you would have sort of rational justification to assent to that proposition. It wouldn't be entirely foolish to think that God exists, right? So for evangelistic purposes, initially speaking, that might be more prudent. But I think ultimately what carries the weight are the 5 ways and variants of them, which you want to eventually try to introduce that to someone so that if they're initially coming to probabilistic arguments, they don't eventually it's going to sell you short and eventually you're going to fall flat, right? And so I think it's important that we introduce the 5 ways and that sort of thinking to folks to know that, hey, even beyond the probabilistic arguments, there's something even better, right? So if you happen to come up against an objection to a probabilistic argument like the Kalam or the fine-tuning, know that that objection may very well not apply to arguments such as the 5 ways.
Gavin, any further thoughts on that? And then I promise, then we're diving in, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between demonstration and persuasion. Demonstration is really just that's sort of scientific knowledge which comes as a result of the proof, whatever proof it is. And it doesn't matter if somebody's persuaded by that. This is the truth which, the demonstration establishes. But I'm a 3rd order Dominican. Karlo's an apologist, so I mean, I'm a member of the Order of Preachers. My vocation is to preach the gospel. So how do we, sort of engage with people in such a way that we do present the truths of the gospel, such as the existence of God, the providence of God, and that. I find that whenever I'm giving this sort of more popular level talks to people, to the various groups, say here in Ireland, when I'm asked in to give these talks, I tend to go with the essence existence one. I don't go into it in the same amount of depth I did in my first book, but I tend to, go with the whole essence existence business. I start with the distinction of per se and per accidens causal series, and the people there seem to get a real intuitive grasp of that through the examples that we use of the hand, stick, and stone, or the fathers producing sons. And then that really, allows us to draw out sort of the nature of causality in each of the series. And then people also have this intuitive grasp of a distinction between essence and existence. We see things coming and going, coming in and out of existence. So we can get a grasp that there is something about the actual existence of things which isn't identical to the essence of the things. And so we can start talking about existence as being in a per se causal series and needing some sort of foundation like pure existence itself. And I find that a lot of the people I engage with, I'm almost sure this is a synthetic a priori. So if anybody's read their Kant, this is a synthetic a priori proposition. I'm going to say, I think everybody is just naturally a Platonist. I think there's a natural Platonism that everybody has. And a lot of those Platonic ways of thinking of participation in something higher, and the higher being the cause for all the participates in it, that resonates with a lot of people. And there's something in the whole notion, the analogy of the sun, that God stands to creation like the sun stands to the earth, which is a very Platonic way of thinking. People grasp that intuitively, that makes sense to them. And so we can explicate how pure existence itself can be a cause of the existence of all things, past, present, and future, by that analogy of the sun. So whenever I'm given those more sort of less specialized talks, that's the route that I would go down. It seems to work for now anyway. Yeah. And then when people want to get a wee bit more specialist, well, we can dance that dance as well.
Yeah, always helps to have good analogies, which you do. Okay, without any further ado, let's start diving in. So, Gavin,
yeah,
where do we begin? Are we just start with the first way? You given us any further background metaphysics, but let's go. Mm-hmm.
I think we should start with the preceding article, just how Aquinas thinks we can demonstrate God's existence, because I think it's important because it gets the context of the 5 ways right from the outset. So should I maybe go into that?
Please, yeah, please do. Anything and everything you think this has to be the definitive conversation, remember. So
okay. So Aquinas, he doesn't think that God's existence is self-evident unless you're standing there in front of God. You know, it's not self-evident. Okay, so well, it's not self-evident to us at least, because we're not right there in front of God. So we do need a demonstration. So how can we demonstrate God's existence? Well, we talked about that syllogism there. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And remember the middle term, man or manhood. You know, all men are mortal. We apply something to men, and then the next premise, Socrates is a man. We bring Socrates under manhood, which from the first premise we see, you know, is mortal. And so we can say Socrates is mortal. There's a problem here. The problem is that in a syllogism like that, you need to know something about the essence of the thing to be demonstrated. Okay, so you need to know something about Socrates, i.e. that he is a man. You need to know something about the essence. It presupposes the existence of the subject of demonstration. And so Aquinas deals with this problem in the second article, the one just before the 5 ways. And he says, well, look, we don't know anything about God. You know, God's existence is just tentative. We can't presuppose it. And we don't know anything about the essence of God the way we do of Socrates. So if we don't know anything about the essence of God, how can we get an appropriate middle term by which we can reason to the existence of God in the way in which we reason to Socrates' mortality in that sort of syllogistic demonstration? Well, what Aquinas does is he makes a distinction between 2 kinds of demonstration. This is part of the logical background. There's one kind of demonstration, and it's called a propter quid demonstration, and it just means on account of the what, propter quid, on account of the whatness or on account of the essence. And such demonstrations presuppose a knowledge of the cause, and they reason to the effect. So they presuppose a knowledge of some cause, reason to the effect. But there's another kind of demonstration, another kind of syllogism, which is it's called a quia syllogism, the because syllogism. And it reasons from the effect to the cause as explaining the effect. Okay, so the effects are so because of the cause. And I don't want to get too bogged down in technical details of logic. There are examples of syllogisms, which are propter quid syllogisms, and quia syllogisms, using the same terms, but only just flipping them about, such as the twinkling of the stars and the closeness of the planets. It comes from Aristotle's posterior analytics. But what Aquinas does then, so he distinguishes between a propter quid and a quia demonstration. And in a quia demonstration, the effects stand in the place of the middle term, and they allow us to deduce something about the cause, which we don't know anything about yet. So they allow us to get to knowledge of a cause by means of the effect. And that means then that that's the sort of demonstrations that we're going to have in the 5 ways. Now, here's the thing. When we're establishing the existence of God, we want to try to establish a cause for the existence of all things, that without which there would be nothing. In the next article on the 5 ways, Aquinas is in the Sed Contra, tells us what God is like. God is he who is. And that's what we're going to try to establish. So if we're going to form a quia demonstration, if we're going to interpret effects in such a way that they can get us to a cause of the being of all things, well, then it's the being of the effects that we have to interrogate to get us to a cause for the being of all things. Later in the Summa, Aquinas says philosophers only started getting an appropriate philosophy of creation when they started considering the being of things without which there would be nothing. Because once we consider the being of things without which there would be nothing, and we consider a cause of that, we have a cause for all things without which nothing would be. And that's what's in the second article of question 2 of the Summa, just before the 5 ways. Aquinas is telling us that we have to interpret the very existence or the being of things and reason to God as the cause of that. So each of the 5 ways has to be seen as interrogating the being of things in terms of their motion, their causality, their necessity, or whatever, and arriving at cause as the being interpreted in that respect. So that kind of sets the context for the 5 ways as metaphysical arguments rather than just physicalistic arguments.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction, because this will help prevent any objections that might be directed at Aquinas's outdated and honestly quite wrong physical understanding of the world, right? Because like Aristotle, Aquinas could be wrong on certain physical details. Yeah. But that wouldn't impinge on his metaphysical reasoning if these really are metaphysical arguments and not physical arguments. Correct?
Exactly. Exactly. The metaphysics is still, made within the play. The physics, well, some of the physics may be outdated, but the metaphysics is still there, and there's no issue with the metaphysics so far as I can see. There's another author wrote a book called The 5 Ways. I'll not name the author. And in that book, he just, made the absurd statement that all of the 5 ways, they depend on an outdated cosmology and astrology, which is just ridiculous. Now, I've named and shamed, well, not shamed that author, but I've named that author in some of my previous work and publication, just so some of the readers might know who that is, but I don't want to name him sort of on the podcast.
But this is important because this is one of those things that I've seen come up again and again, especially on the popular level YouTube videos, right? Is this kind of hand-waving dismissal, it's not just of Aquinas, but Aristotle and just anybody who wasn't in the modern understanding of the scientific worldview. That because they had some of their scientific details wrong, they were probably, if not definitely wrong about everything. And there's not this fine and necessary distinction drawn between metaphysical reasoning and metaphysical demonstrations versus, probabilistic physical reasoning, like Carlos was talking about with fine-tuning arguments or arguments from complexity. These are just different types of arguments altogether. So we got to make sure we're not conflating the two. Carlo, was anything you wanted to add to any of that?
No, I think that was a beautiful tee up. And in fact, Gavin, possibly we can tease out that distinction starting with the first way. Like, for example, how do we take motion, right? So some philosophers will start with motion, which is the starting point of Aquinas's first way, and read motion as physical motion, like motion that you find only within the boundaries of physical reality, sort of a progressive actualization of a potential, right? So you got the two terms, the beginning and the end, and physical motion is that in-between stage, the not yet achieved. And some philosophers will run the argument starting from physical motion, and then that line of argumentation, as we could talk about it more, only gets you to an incorporeal mover that's not moved with the same type of motion that you started with, namely physical motion, right? So you only get to a mind. And but then you also you have to employ the more robust metaphysical reasoning to account for quote unquote motion or the change of the incorporeal mover or mind if it's not purely pure actuality, right?
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, you know, do you start with the physical stuff and then eventually jump to the metaphysical plane, or is Aquinas intending to just start with the metaphysical principles right off the bat and read motion as, rather than a progressive actualization of a potential, just an actualization of a potential? And then you're immediately off to easily getting, well, I would argue easily, but that's contestable, right? But you know what I mean? To get off to a being such that is pure actuality.
Okay, so real quick, because we just introduced a whole bunch of terms that people might not be familiar, which is totally. I love where we're going with this. I love all of it, but let's just maybe reintroduce some like actuality, potentiality.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that people can track us for as long as possible. At some point, we are just going to dive off to the deep end, and that's fine. You can revisit this conversation after you've read Gavin's books, and things will click. So yeah, Gavin. All right. So with those distinctions in mind, where do we want to go from there?
Yeah. Okay. So just a word to follow up on Karlo's point there is that Aquinas was well aware of physical presentations of the motion argument, because that was Aristotle's argument in the physics. And Aristotle, at the end of the physics, arrives at some prime mover of the heavenly spheres of the heavens, which was more or less just a world soul. And Aquinas actually argues that, you know, well, this isn't God. That needs to be kind of topped up with the reasoning in the metaphysics, where you have, you know, some sort of final cause which motivates the movement that world soul makes. So Aquinas wasn't satisfied with Aristotle's argument. The first way is not Aristotle's argument for motion. That needs to be said. It just isn't. It may have some sort of skeletal structure to it, which is the same, but it just isn't. So the best way maybe is to just present the argument, and then we can just unpack it. So Aquinas says, is that all right, Pat? Is that all right?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive in.
So I don't have it in front of me, so I'll just download it from a memory. Aquinas observes that there's motion in the world. This is just self-evident. We just see motion. We undergo motion. We feel motion all the time. There is motion in the world. Now, what he does is he analyzes that motion, as Karlo says, in terms of act and potency. So he thinks, well, look, this is interesting. We have motion here. You know, what is this? And he says, well, look, motion is the actualization of a potential. That's what it is. And he gives the example of a piece of wood being cold is potentially hot, but it's not actually hot because it's actually cold at the time. So in order to become hot, the wood has to be potentially hot, but actually cold. And then whenever it gets hot, it's actually hot, but potentially cold. So that's what he takes motion to be. He analyzes it in terms of act and potency. Now, that's related to the analysis of motion that you get in Aristotle's physics, but it's kind of different, because in Aristotle's physics, the analysis that we get of motion is the one that Karlo pointed out, which is the gradual moving to a new state, this progressive sort of motion to a new state. Whereas in the first way, what you're getting from Aquinas, aside from the sort of the example of the wood being heated, the example, what you're getting in the analysis is that motion is just the actualization of potential. That's what it is. So you have motion and you have something that is moved whenever you have something which is dependent for its actuality in some way. So the way the wood is dependent on the fire for heat, or the way we on the earth are dependent on the sun for our illumination, that sort of thing. Now, that's what it is to be moved. Things which are like that, things which are dependent for their actuality, can also move or actualize other things. And so we have movers which are themselves moved. So we have moved movers. And Aquinas says, well, okay, we have this sort of causal interaction, you know, of movers, you know, causing motion or actuality in others. We can set up a nice wee sort of causal regress here. And the question is, does that go to infinity? Is that without a primary cause? And this is where you get this really sort of famous analysis of that causal series in terms of a per se causal series. Pat, you and I have been over that several times before. And just a basic rundown of it, the example that Thomas gives in the first way is that if you have a hand moving a stick to move the stone, the hand, the stick, and the stone in themselves are immobile. They don't have the causal actuality of motion in themselves. Hands, sticks, and stones just don't move by themselves. They need something that gives them motion. So you have some sort of mental agent which imparts motion to the hand, the stick, and the stone. The mental agent has the motion of the series, the causal actuality of the series, essentially, in himself, and he imparts it to the hand, stick, and stone. Hand, stick, and stone participate in the motion or the causality or the actuality which the mental agent imparts to the series. Given that the hand, stick, and stone are essentially immobile, they're immobile in themselves, they don't have the actuality of the series in themselves. If you remove, say, the mental agent, the hand, the stick, and the stone wouldn't move. So in those sorts of series, they're called per se causal series. If you have members of the series which are dependent for their actuality, which don't have the actuality, in this case the motion of the series in themselves, and you don't have a primary cause for that actuality, a primary cause which does possess the actuality in itself, then those things, those movers, won't have actuality. But they do have actuality. That's what the first premise of the first way states, in which case we do need a primary cause for the motion that anything has, bearing in mind that motion is the actualization of a potential. So we need a primary cause for the actualization of any potential. And that primary cause is what we take God to be, pure actuality, that which actualizes any potential.
So the one point I want to highlight, and then we'll have Karlo jump in here, is that this type of causal series, and sometimes you hear different terminology for it, per se, essentially ordered, hierarchical, I know Ed Fazer uses. So if you hear these different terms, they're largely talking about the same type of causal series that looks at a causal series where there's a real dependency relationship, right? A real dependency relationship. And I think what Gavin's saying, I'll try and put it in different words, is that if A is dependent on B, and B is dependent on C, and C is dependent on D, and so on, ad infinitum, if you try to regress this type of dependency relation infinitely, you're really just infinitely deferring the effects, meaning you're never going to have those conditions for that dependency relation fulfilled, meaning you're never in principle going to have that effect. It's just not going to be there. And in the order of, if we're talking about existence, then we're really, then if we try to push this type of causal series in relation to existence to infinity, we're committing ourselves to the absurdity ultimately that nothing exists. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if we think that at least something exists, even if just this conversation, then this cannot regress to infinity. You think that's a fair way of summarizing it? And Karlo, I'd love for you to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, but what you say is that you would just have an infinite number of dependent things with nothing on which to depend. If you have that sort of series, you know, you wouldn't have the hook on which they could all hang. And Aquinas grants that you could have an infinite number of dependent things. They would still have to have something on which to depend. That's why he grants the possibility of a beginningless created universe.
Mm-hmm. Because each within that series of motion, the stone moved by the stick, moved by the hand. Let's take the stick and focus on the stick. The stick, as Gavin pointed out, has nothing within its nature to act as mover of stone, right? So the question becomes, can you have an infinite number of those things and account for the motion of the stone, the actualization of the stone's potential to move from point A to point B? Or you could state it differently, can you have an infinite number of things such as the stick and have the stick being a mover? And the answer is no, because if the stick has nothing of itself to be an act of being a mover, and you just posit something else like the stick, that next thing, that next mover is not going to have the act of being a mover of itself. And so whenever you postulate an infinite regress of such things that do not have the act of being a mover of itself, well, then you have nothing from which these movers in the series can be or have the act of being a mover. And if you have nothing or no source from which these movers can have the actuality of being a mover, right? The actuality to actualize the potential of the stone or the potential of the movers to be actualized, then you have no actualization. You have no mover being an active mover. So reason demands there necessarily must be a source, some mover that has the act of being a mover of itself. In order to account for one mover that doesn't have the act of being a mover of itself, or an infinite number of movers that doesn't have the act of being a mover of itself. You have to have one that has the act of being a mover of itself, from which that act of being a mover can be derived. For without such a being, then there would be nothing to make the potential of the movers and even the effect, namely the stone, there would be nothing to make the potential different than what it is. Namely, there would be nothing to actualize the potential. So it would just be, it would remain potentiality. And you would have no movers having the act of being a mover, and consequently, no effect of the potential of the stone moving from my left foot to my right foot, actually moving from my left foot to my right foot.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's both really great illustrations. So I just want to, once you have this sort of example in mind, and once you kind of understand the type or the nature of the causal series in question, then we have to discern, well, what is, okay, now specifically for Aquinas' first way, what is the causal property that we're asking about, right?
Yeah.
And we're pushing for the existentialist interpretation, right? So Gavin, take us that way. I think hopefully we've made clear that there is at least a certain type of causal series that cannot in principle regress to infinity. And this is the type of causal series that Aquinas is saying is this is what we're analyzing in the first way. Now, what is that causal property that is under analysis?
Yeah, so we've been talking about the actuality of things, that because motion is the actualizing of a potential, when we get to that primary mover, which has the causality of motion in itself, on which everything else depends for its motion, what we're saying there is that it has actuality in itself on which everything else depends for its actuality. Now, when we look at moved movers, what we realize is that they are able to grant actuality to other things, but they also participate in actuality themselves. So what motion reveals to us is the dependent status of the thing which is a moved mover, dependent status in terms of actuality. But if it's dependent in terms of its actuality, that reveals its existential status, because anything which is dependent in terms of actuality is dependent in terms of existence, because nothing which is dependent for actuality exists in virtue of what it is. Because if it is dependent for actuality, minimally it's dependent on what Aquinas calls its active existence. All actuality flows from your active existence. If you did not exist, you would not be able to confer any actuality on anything else. You would have no actuality of your own. Existence is the act of all acts. So being a moved mover then reveals one's dependency for existence. So that when you have a primary cause of motion, primary source of all actuality, what you actually have is a primary source of all existence. And that which is the primary source of motion, which has the causality of motion or actuality in itself, has existence in itself. It just is pure existence itself, which in the said contra of the article on the 5 ways is what we understand God to be, he who is, that which is pure existence. And that's why at the end then Thomas says, well, look, this is what all understand God to be.
Right. So, I mean, this is the critical insight and the critical hinge point, I think, of the argument. And this is where you actually will get some interdebate among Thomists as well.
Oh yeah.
So I want to spend some time on this, and I want to drive this, because what we're saying is that certain things are caused to exist, right? Really, in a very radical sense. And again, let's make the distinction that Aquinas is not trying to trace back a bunch of dominoes to the Big Bang. This is not a temporal question. He wants to know why anything exists here and now. Why does Pat Flynn exist here and now? Why does Carlo Broussard? Why does Gavin Kerr? What keeps them? What is actualizing our existence here and now? And Aquinas famously grants that, look, even if you had an eternal universe, you're still not going to be able to escape this argument, right? And so again, it's just one of the very, very common misunderstandings. This is not searching out a temporal beginning of the universe and saying that God had to flick the first domino. It's much more radical than that, saying that if God ceased his causal operations at any second, we would just go we'd go poof, right? I love the way that Father Spitzer sometimes puts it. He's like, if God stopped thinking about you for 1 second, you'd be nothing, gone, right?
Absent to nothingness.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's the radical nature of these types of arguments. And I want to drive that point just so we can make sure we stay on the right direction. So Gavin, help us, continue on and help us really get this point. Because once we get this point, it should carry over actually pretty easily into the other five, most of the other 5 ways as well, right?
Yeah.
And Karlo, I'm sorry, you wanted to hop in? Yep.
Yeah, I just want to make one note before you move on, Gavin. Would you agree that what's driving that analysis is that fundamental philosophical principle of action follows being, right?
Yeah.
So that if the activity of something, such as the stick's act of being a mover, if that act is dependent upon some cause outside of itself, and since action follows being, then the very existence of the stick is going to be dependent as well. So that derived causality of being a mover, that derived act of being a mover, as you said, beautifully reveals a sort of a window or a gateway into seeing the existential dependence of the thing, right? So whether, and then I'd like to get your thoughts on this too. It seems like we could utilize this principle in one of 2 ways, or both ways. We could utilize the principle just with the stick itself, starting there. If the stick's act of being a mover is dependent, then its existence is dependent. And so now we need to find a source of esse or existence, right? Yeah. Or perhaps it seems that we could follow the line of reasoning of the stick. Act of being a mover is derived from the hand. That's like the stick. Its act of being a mover is derived from something else. And so we need to posit a mover that has the act of being a mover of itself, in which case it would be pure actuality, and then use the principle action follows being and analyze such a purely actual being and say that's pure existence as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Karlo, what you're saying is you could kind of come at it either way and arrive.
That's right. Yeah. Now, whether how Aquinas is doing it, I'm not quite sure. Gavin's the expert, but it seems like we would have 2 approaches there utilizing that principle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Both approaches I think work, and it just really depends on what sort of argument you want to make when you're making the argument. The first approach that you suggest, if you just look at the stick and you see the existential dependency of the stick, that's more like the de ente argument from chapter 4. Whereas the second approach is where we go through this sort of the causal actuality of the series, the hand, the stick, and the stone, and we find something which has the causality in itself. And then we apply the action follows being principle to see, well, actually that kind of causality is really just the existential causality that things have, because their dependency is revelatory of their dependency on being.
And do you think that would justify Aquinas saying, and this is what we all call God, when he arrives at the first mover as pure act, and then say, this is what we call God, the underlying assumption being that from pure act, you could get to pure existence. Ipsum esse subsistens.
Exactly. Whenever Aquinas is thinking of pure act, he is thinking of pure existence. And just a couple of questions later, you get that very famous phrase from Aquinas, esse existence is the act of all acts. So, that is always in the background of Aquinas' thought when he talks about actuality. Everywhere in his work, he's thinking of actuality in terms of existence. It's not too far, off the radar.
Right.
So real quick, action follows being. Again, that's something that we introduced. That can we explain a little bit more what we mean by that?
Yeah. So the only way I can act in any way, the only way I can act or engage in some sort of action is if I exist in act, is if I am a being. A non-being cannot act. So I have my sort of primary actuality, which is my act of existence. And then on the basis of that, I'm able to engage in actuality in the world. So if you have something which is engaging in actuality in the world, that's revelatory of its being. Okay, of the kind of being that it is. And if its action in the world is a kind of dependent action or dependent actuality, that's revelatory of its dependence for actuality.
Man, that's beautifully put. If you don't mind, just to geek out a little bit here, I'll admit, this was revolutionary for me, because when I was analyzing the first way and trying to wrap my head around it and figure it out, like I started with the stick, its act of being a mover is derived, right? And then I was able to arrive at a first mover who has the act of being a mover of itself. But then the question comes up, well, okay, well, maybe it's underived in its act of being a mover ultimately of the stone, but is there any potential in such a first mover for some other act and some other line of causality?
Yeah.
And this is where that principle came into play, because I started reasoning with the help of other philosophers and say, well, okay, this is where we have to get to that first act of the second act, right? So if such a first mover were dependent in its existence, right, in its first actuality, the primary actuality of its existence, then its act of being a mover would be dependent and caused as well.
Yeah.
But since its act of being a dependent mover of the stone is uncaused, therefore its existence must be uncaused. Yep. And if its existence is uncaused, well, then any action that flows from its existence, no matter what line of causality we're talking about, is going to be uncaused as well. And so thus we have a purely actual being that has no potential for its activity in any line of causality.
Yeah. And that's how all the 5 ways run, in my opinion. That's how I think every one of them runs. It takes something, well, we've got motion now, but we'll see what it is in the next ways. And it traces to something primary. And in its being primary, it is pure actuality and sort of pure existence itself. Anything which is dependent for the sort of causality in any of the ways, that dependency is revelatory of its dependent status as an existing thing.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. So just to kind of give a quick summary, what we're really after here now on the existentialist interpretation is that which is able to actualize the potential for the existence of any possible being without itself having to have its own existence actualized. That's the metaphysical level that we're operating on. And we have to get to something that is pure actuality, that has no admixture of any potentiality whatsoever. And then it's from pure actuality that we can begin to unpack, as Aquinas does famously, all the divine attributes, everything from omnipotence to omniscience to perfect goodness and so on. Maybe we'll get there in this conversation. Honestly, probably not. Maybe, well, who knows? We'll see. We'll see. We can't keep Gavin here all night. It's late over there for him.
That's all right.
But all right. So before we move on to the other ways, I want to make sure we get final thoughts on this one, and maybe I don't know if we should consider objections for each individual one or just save them to the end, but pure, why does it have to be pure actuality, right? Why can't it just be like 96% actuality or 75% sounds like it. Or why can't it be 75%? Why full, pure, unactualized actuality? Why that?
Okay, well, so let's stick with the quantifying sort of, an analogy. Even it's kind of alien to the way Aquinas is going to think about this, but it can be useful. So let's say this thing is only 95% actual. Well, then it itself isn't the source of all actuality, because 5% of its actuality is caused by something else, and so it's only the source of, say, 95% of any actuality. It itself having some sort of source for 5% of its actuality, so it's not the source of all actuality.
Yeah, I think this gets back to what I was trying to get at a while ago, and that is to say, okay, we have to think, if this primary mover that has the act of being a mover of itself, and then you're suggesting, Pat, that maybe it has potential to some other activity, what would be required for some other action that it has to be caused? Well, the bottom line is that it would have to have its existence to be caused, right? Because if its existence is not caused, then no activity that it has can be caused, right? And so in that case, you would have pure actuality. So I'm thinking about it like this. If this primary mover's existence would be caused, then what its act of being a mover would be caused.
Yeah.
But we've already demonstrated in our reasoning that its act of being a mover cannot be caused. Therefore, its existence cannot be caused.
Yeah.
And if its existence cannot be caused, then no action of such a primary mover can be caused, in which case it has no potential for any activity to be actualized by another, in which case it would be purely actual.
Yeah, and I'm throwing these things out to kind of halfway be funny, but to get us to clarify what can be very abstract concepts for people. So we're saying, kind of maybe think of it like this, right? If it had a potential part, yeah, what would the consequences of this be? Well, it would need to have that potential part actualized, its existence actualized, which in that sense, we haven't gotten to the fundamental actualizer, right? We just stopped our regress prematurely, right? It's this other thing that is the fundamental actualizer. Well, you say, well, maybe nothing can actualize that potential part. Maybe you want to go that way and you do want to stop, but then you're not really talking about a potential part, because then you're just saying it's a potential part that can never be actualized. And what you're really saying there is it's a non-potential, right? Because it's a potential part that has no potential for actualization. You're just saying it's a possible, impossible state of affairs. So really what you've posited there is just nothing. You've just posited nothing. And then we're back to pure actuality from that direction. So it's really something I think you can't avoid. No matter which way you try and take it, you're going to have to terminate at that which is pure actuality, right? Yeah.
If a thing has a potential part, well, we ask, or a part of it is impotency, we ask, well, how do you know it has that part? And, you maybe observe and you say, well, look, there's that part which is impotency. And you say, well, okay, well, that part exists. So its potency is being actualized because it has existence. So anything which has something in it which is impotency is ultimately, fundamentally being actualized by the act of existence. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that part of it in potency. That part would simply be nothing, as you say.
So yeah, could we run it this way? If it had a part that is actualized by another, and given the fact that action follows being, then its very being or existence would be caused. And if its being or existence were caused, then its act of being a mover of the stone would be caused.
Yeah.
But we already showed that its act of being a mover of the stone is not caused in order to account for the motion of the stone. And so therefore, its act of being cannot be caused, and therefore it cannot have any part to be actualized by another, to be in potency to actualization.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And I think it's kind of interesting and cool to see how we can kind of secure that same conclusion from different angles. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, any final thoughts on the first way from either of you two before we jump into the second way?
Just to point out, this is not Aristotle's first way from the physics. If you read Aristotle's first way in Physics, Book 7, Book 8, other than a kind of a skeletal sort of thing where you've got motion and you've got whatever's moved is moved by another and all of that, this is not that argument.
Yeah, yeah, you'll realize that pretty quick if you go back to Aristotle after listening to this conversation.
And I'm sure you would affirm, Gavin, that it's not only not Aristotle's argument as we're presenting it, but you would hold that this is not what Aquinas is presenting as well in the Summa Theology.
Yeah, I'm of the mind that the sort of reason that the reading that I give of Aquinas, I think was what Aquinas was thinking in writing the Summa Theology. So it's one thing to be philosophically defensible. It's another thing to be kind of, genuine. I think it's both.
Yeah, which is, I wanted to point that out because what we're trying to defend here is not only a version that we think is successful, but we're also defending that this is Aquinas' version. So we're really saying that Aquinas himself was successful.
But one thing is beautiful in my research on the 5 ways, in reading all of the variations on how to read Aquinas, at the end of the day, one of the beautiful things that you come out with is, let's just say all of these variations aren't what Aquinas is saying, right? And like this one is, but these 5 other variations are not what Aquinas is saying. You actually have a variety of demonstrations for God's existence that, are connected to each other and similar, but with the variations, it provides more arguments for God's existence.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
And I suppose the last thing I'll say on that is that Aristotle famously said that, look, we're friends with the Platonists, but we're friends with the truth even more. So if we have to disagree with the Platonists, we'll go with the truth. If my reading of the argument, is true, that it's a true demonstration, and I do think that, but that's not what Aquinas was thinking, well, then I'll just part way with Aquinas. I'm friends with Thomas. He's my brother Dominican. I hope to see him in heaven someday. But I think this reading of the argument leads to the true demonstration. And if Aquinas didn't think that, well, so be it.
So be it. Yeah.
And that other reading might be sound as well.
Yeah. Beautiful stuff. Okay. Real quick, actually, because just to give a tease before we start going to the other 5 ways, because I'm sure somebody's listening or thinking, okay, this has gotten really abstract. They're talking about something called pure actuality, and they're saying that this pure actuality is God. Help me see that connection there. Gavin, can you just tease out a few, you don't have to go in depth, but tease out a few paths of how Aquinas would say this is how we can start to unpack some of the divine attributes that when we actually analyze what pure actuality would have to be, we're going to get really to classical theism.
Yeah. So if God is pure actuality, as we've just seen, he has no potency. For anything to be composite, it needs to be potency. It needs to have some sort of potency, which is actualized. So any composition is the actualization of some potency. But if this is pure actuality with no potency, then there's no composition. It's not even able to be composite. It's lacking that necessary condition to be composite, which means that this being, this thing, which is pure actuality, this primary cause, pure actuality, is utterly simple. So you've got some sort of utterly simple primary cause of all that is. Because it's pure actuality, it's able to act, it's able to bring things about. Its pure actuality is in virtue of its being pure existence itself. Outside of existence, there is nothing. So there is nothing which constrains its ability to act, which makes it omnipotent. So you've got an omnipotent, utterly simple cause of all that is. There's all sorts of arguments which we can run for its having an intellect.
Yeah.
I think
we'll save those because I know they're a little more technical, but let's just do one more. Okay. Unrestricted in power, right? It can bring about all possibilities in being, right? Because this has to be that which can actualize the potential for anything else to exist, right? That seems like a clear definition of omnipotence to me. It's ontologically utterly simple. And maybe we can touch on divine simplicity later. We've talked about that in previous episodes.
Wouldn't it follow too, Gavin, that it would be absolutely immutable, having no potency to be actualized? It would be immutable and
unchanging.
Couldn't change in any way whatsoever.
Can't change.
Yeah.
And the last one then is it's utterly good, pure goodness itself. Yep. Because if it's pure actuality, pure existence, there is nothing outside of it which is good for it, but it is good for everything else, precisely because the goodness of the thing lies in its perfection, and it's being completed in some sort of way. But a thing is only completed in virtue of actuality. That's how you're completed. Something actualizes you in some way and completes you and thus perfects you. If this being is primary cause, is pure actuality, there's nothing which actualizes it, so nothing good for it, but it actualizes everything else, then it is the source of perfection and thus goodness for everything else. And so it is the good itself.
Yeah, the good itself. It's literally what Plato would call the good. Just we're refining that quite a bit, right? Yeah. And the one, I'll add one more. It's unique. There's one and only one, and there can only be one, because to have more than one pure actuality, you would have to have some differentiating feature, meaning there'd have to be some lack. One would have to lack something the other had, and then it's not pure actuality anymore. So we're really committed to. We really are, when you unpack this, committed to classical theism, which is monotheism. One God, radically transcendent, eternal, immutable, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, perfectly loving, and so on. And we can get all this just by unpacking the conclusion of the first way argument, right? Yeah.
And already I would say there's an awful lot of resonances there with the revealed God of Judeo-Christian tradition, of Yahweh as he who is. So already, and we haven't sort of presupposed that, we're not sort of aiming towards that, we're just doing the philosophy here, but already there's a coincidence between the revealed God as Yahweh and what we're discovering here in philosophy.
Right. So I would want to say, like, if you're like kind of agnostic on religion and you think, well, maybe a religion's true, maybe it's not true. What we can do here with natural theology and metaphysics is we can kind of narrow down the hunt of possibly true options. If these arguments are true, we've just knocked polytheism out. Like, that's just not a live option anymore. Or if it is, it's dependent on monotheism, right? Same thing with pantheism. Like, if these arguments go through, God is not the universe, right? The universe is a composite. It's changing. It moves from potential states to actual states. Whatever the universe is, it's an effect. It's a creation. So any religions that are committed to polytheism or pantheism, they might have some true things in them. They might have some good things in them, but they can't be the true religion if there is a true religion. So there's a sort of a would you say it's fair to say at the very least there's a convergence, like we kind of said at the beginning of the episode, but if nothing else, maybe a winnowing effect if we're kind of on the hunt for if any religion is true. We're not saying that anyone is true, but if you're open to the possibility, maybe this is a path that might help you on that.
Yeah, that's one of the purposes that natural theology provides for us. It provides us a tool by which we can analyze and assess alleged revelation, to weed out our possible options to see if this ultimate reality we call God, pure actuality, revealed himself, right? Yeah. And because whatever such a being does reveal in no way will contradict that which we know metaphysically by the natural light of human reason.
Yeah. And even somewhat stronger than that, this is a point I made in my first book, that when you get that Mosaic conception of God as Yahweh, the book of Exodus, there is no known historical antecedent for that conception of God. It seems to just be unique there and then to, that Jewish experience, that Mosaic experience. How did the scriptural author or that community come up with that? And is it just a coincidence that it's in accord with this really sort of abstract, fundamental metaphysics? Because they weren't metaphysicians, thinking this through the way we are. So how did that get into their sort of psyche, and that, makes us countenance the possibility that, well, this being did reveal himself like that.
They definitely weren't projecting that onto reality, right?
That struck me like a ton of bricks, Gavin and Karlo, when I was kind of trying to figure all this stuff out, when I was trying to study and understand these metaphysical demonstrations. And then, they get you to the conclusion of God as pure act, pure existence itself. And then you read this coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence at all, right? Ultimately, in when God reveals his name of I am that I am, you have to at least take a step back and consider that it's more than a coincidence, I think, at that point.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Second way, is that where we're gonna just keep going through then?
So Gavin, are we going to get to generation of species being dependent and caused by the movement of the celestial spheres here, or are we going to go another route?
I think we'll go another route. I don't think that'll be it.
Perfect. Yeah, we want to be thorough, but also give the minimum effective dose here.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, really, if you understand that first way, the second way just follows so easily, because the second way is taken from efficient causality, the nature of the efficient cause. The efficient cause is basically what any of us think of when we just think of a cause. A causes B, brings about some sort of motion in B, something like that. And the idea here is that no effect precedes itself in existence. Okay, so an effect comes to exist from its cause. Some sort of an efficient cause brings it about. And Aquinas says, well, look, if you remove the cause, you remove the effect. You remove the cause, you remove the effect. So the effect depends on its cause for its being. And Aquinas says, okay, well, let's have a look at that. And he sets up again another sort of, causal series. And again, it's per se causal series. He denies that it could be infinite for the sort of reasons we have been discussing, because the members within that causal series are dependent for their causality. And just think about the causality in question there. The effect depends on its cause for its being. The effect would not be without its cause. So the cause actualizes the effect in some respect. So if we have a per se causal series where efficient causality is up for grabs, it's the being of the effects, which is the kind of causality. That is, the existence of the effects. And for the same reasons that we deny that a per se series could be infinite in the first way, it applies here again in the second way. We need some sort of primary cause for the causality or the being of the effects in the series, and that primary cause is what we call God, pure existence itself.
Yeah, so Gavin, in the second way, when Aquinas says that now in efficient cause, he says there is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Is it true to say that right there he's assuming that such a thing is even subject to causality, right? So he's not starting off with the possibility that such a thing is existence itself. He's just starting off with this thing that we're going to analyze, it's subject to being caused, right? Mm-hmm. And consequently, he's just running from there and saying it can't be the cause of its own being, of itself.
Yeah.
So that's my first inquiry, my first question to you, is just sort of starting off with things that are subject to being caused. And they're going to have to be caused by something outside of themselves because they can't cause themselves, right? Yeah. And then secondly, you talked about the being of the effect. Mm-hmm. I know philosophers go back and forth as to precisely what is the second way trying to account for. Mm-hmm. Is it just the being of any effect, like the accidental quality of my coffee mug here being suspended 3 feet above the ground? That's like an actuality, right? Mm-hmm. Or is it seeking to account for the substantial existence of the cup itself? Mm-hmm. So do you see how I'm trying to precisely what do you think Aquinas is getting at when you speak of the being of the effect?
Yeah. Okay. So with regard to the first point, I think you're right. When he's looking at effects, he's just talking about things which are subject to causality. And elsewhere, when Aquinas analyzes causality, he points out that a thing is subject to causality, a thing is an effect, because it stands in potency in some respect, and it has that potency actualized. The respect in which that potency is actualized comes from the cause of that effect. So the cause is what actualizes the potency. So when we get to that second question then, what exactly is Aquinas, after here, when he's talking about the being of the effect? He's talking about the actuality of whatever effect it is in question. So you can talk about some sort of, accident of something. So, my hair's being a particular color, there's some sort of cause which brings about the actuality of that. But the being of accidents or the actuality of accidents is ultimately dependent upon the actuality of this substance. And the actuality of the substance is ultimately dependent upon the cause of the actuality of the substance. Because we know substances are dependent, things which are dependent for their actuality, like movers in the first way. So we're looking for ultimately we're looking for some sort of cause for the actuality or the existence of substances.
And in order to, so if Aquinas is just starting from this general notion of just the being of an effect, and it can't be prior to itself, right? So it's going to have a cause outside of itself because it can't cause itself. And then we're off to the regress of caused causes. Do you think there in the regress that Aquinas sort of in the background is reverting to, well, if cause A of the effect is itself caused in its being, then he's in the background reverting to the de ente et essentia, on being in essence, that such a cause's very existence, like its substantial existence, would not be had of its own very essence, but would be, quote unquote, accidental, right? It wouldn't be of its essence, but be derived. And that's what's going to necessitate the need for a first cause that has existence of itself to give to those causes in the series that accounts for the being of the effect.
Yep. That's precisely how I read the second way. I published a chapter in a book a few years ago which gave that exact reading of the second way, that whenever Aquinas does set up that regress, it's the de ente reasoning all over again. He is asking about the actuality of the members within the regress, which actuality is ultimately explicable in terms of their having existence or esse And so he's looking for a primary cause of esse or of existence.
All right. Now, Pat, if I may ask this one more question here, man. I got
do.
Gavin Kerr here.
No, I love it, man. I love it. Mine's a side point anyway, so keep going.
Okay. Let's think about this, guys. We're in this regress of caused causes. That's revelatory. If a cause is caused by something else, right? That's revelatory that its existence doesn't belong to itself of its very nature. Okay. How would you respond to a brute fact skeptic who comes along and says, okay, I'll grant you that a thing's essence is distinct from its existence, right? Because if it's being caused to exist, then apparently it doesn't have existence of itself. So there's got to be a distinction between its essence, what it is, and its very existence, that by in virtue of which the essence is real, right? So let's say somebody says, I'll grant you that there is a distinction between essence and existence. But that cause we're analyzing has its existence, and there's a union between essence and existence in virtue of nothing. So it does not have the existence in virtue of itself, nor does it have the existence in virtue of a cause outside of itself, and thus an attempt to break the causal chain back to the first cause.
Right. And let me just chime in real quick here, just for people who are new to the conversation. The brute fact objection is arguably one of the most common. And I think it's probably the strong, like if I were to try and go back to my atheist days and like really push my atheism through, this is probably where I would go. I would probably try and push the brute fact. And to be clear, a brute fact is not saying that
you just don't know it.
Yeah. It's not saying that we don't know it. It's saying in principle, there is no explanation. We just get to some thing, some bottom level thing, whatever, and it's just there. No explanation to be discovered, no explanation needed, the end, conversation over. So yeah, Gavin, what's your response to that?
So if our brute fact objector accepts that essence and existence are distinct, well, essence and existence are related as potency and act. Existence is what actualizes the essence. Now, if our brute fact objector will say, okay, yeah, essence and existence are distinct, and you have existence in the thing which actualizing the essence, but we don't need to go searching for an extrinsic cause of that. It's just a brute fact that, the two are united in the thing. I will ask the brute fact objector, okay, if you're going to say that, why is it in other contexts that you're willing to grant that act potency relationship is revelatory of causality, but not in this case? Either you arbitrarily apply or are happy to apply causality to cases of act and potency in other instances, but not in this case. And unless they can give me a set of criteria by which they will not apply the act potency dependency as revelatory of causality in the case of essence and existence, unless they can give me a set of criteria, which they're not committed to doing because they think it's a brute fact, then to my mind, they just arbitrarily refuse to consider the question of some sort of cause of existence here. And I would want to know what the motivation for that is. Is it just to shut off this sort of argument? So in order for them to be consistent, they would have to deny causality in every other act potency situation in order to deny it here as well.
Right. So real quick, because Karlo, I know we were jamming about this the other day, so I've been thinking about it a little bit more, especially because I know you're kind of trying to do some research to see if there's actually an outright contradiction.
Right. Can we reduce the denial of an extrinsic cause that accounts for the essence and existence unity or conjoining? Can we reduce that denial to a contradiction?
Yeah. So you got me thinking about this, Karlo, and I haven't made up my mind on it right now, because my traditional response would be, to say everything that Gavin did, to say like, this seems like a real funny case of special pleading, friend, and it's hard to take it seriously, like classic taxi cab fallacy. It's like, you never act like this in any other situation until God starts popping up on the philosophical radar screen. Then suddenly brute facts start appearing. Like, it's pretty convenient, right? But okay, right? Fair enough. So we want to say more to it. The other, of course, is, Phaser says this is like, well, look, we're giving you an explanation. And, we should try to explain things as far as we can. So before you start invoking brute facts, like, what's wrong with the explanation we're giving you? Because this, like, is a beautiful explanation. And it actually gives us a completely coherent worldview. So, like, even if they're competing explanations, why don't you favor the better one? That's another approach. And then I've always liked the sort of retorsion approach, the reductio approach. It's like, once you let in a little brute fact, everything goes down, right? If things can just happen for no reason, no causal connection at all, you're violating the PSR, then that could happen to your cognitive states, to all your beliefs. And then you have no reason to trust anything you believe, including your brute fact proposals, right? So you just take the whole system down in sort of a reductio to say, okay, you can't even really sustain this. But I see what you're saying, Karlo, is like, okay, that's absurd. Now, absurd is good enough for Pat Flynn, right? If I can, if your position is absurd, then I'm not really bothered by it anymore. But you want to try, what you've been thinking about is like, we can go beyond just incoherence or absurdity. Maybe, I don't know if you're committed to this yet, but maybe there's even just contradiction there,
right,
as well, right?
I would say a contradiction involves incoherence and absurdity. I see a couple of ways. So, for example, Gavin, I don't know if you've read. I guess if it's a positive statement about an author, can we say it? For example, I'm fond of John Canassis and his book on Thomistic cosmological reasoning. And I'm interested to engage a little bit. It seems as if he's got something going here. I've also been introduced to it by a philosopher friend of mine, Scott Sullivan, who got it from John Canassis in his dissertation, The Principle of Sufficient Reason, Thomistic Principle of Sufficient Reason. And the idea is that if it's operating on the principle that if esse or existence, right, and essence are distinct, that the esse is quote unquote accidental. Now, of course, I know that brings up red flags for a lot of other Thomists out there, but accidental in that it's not of the essence, right? Yeah. But also emphasizing its priority. It's a unique accident, right? It's not posterior, it's prior to the thing that it's actuating. Okay, so, but embedded in the notion of an accident is dependency, right? Yeah. So if we say, if we follow the brute facts reasoning and say that the unity of essence and existence is in virtue of neither itself nor an extrinsic cause, then what you're saying is that you have an esse, existence, that's dependent in as much as it's an accident, but at the same time not dependent in as much as it's not accounted for neither in virtue of itself or an extrinsic cause. Then you're asserting esse that's dependent and not dependent at the same time and in the same respect. And John Canassis argues in his book, Thomistic Cosmological Reasoning, I don't think I'm getting the title exactly right there, but he emphasizes like 5 different times in the book that he sees that as pretty much the only way of defending the Thomistic principle of sufficient reason, right? And then, of course, Lagrange, he tries to take this route of relation, of saying that the brute fact skeptic here in our scenario, as we've articulated, has to assert a relation and not a relation of the two principles, essence and existence, at the same time in the same respect. So there seems like there's something there. I'm still mulling over it myself and thinking through it, but it seems like there's something there that we could possibly reduce the brute fact skeptic to a contradiction, holding a contradiction.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say to that is I've read Nassis's book, Thomistic Existentialism, Cosmological Reasoning, at least twice now. And yeah, great book and everything. I do differ with him just on, I mean, it's an intra-Thomistic difference, right, just on how to characterize esse, the active existence and all that. And you know, you pointed out, you know, when we talk about esse as accident and stuff, you know, red flags are set off.
Right,
and
right.
Those ones, you know, with not just red flags, but fireworks, volcanoes, you know, going off in my mind.
The things that excite philosophers, let me tell you.
And so, because I have a slightly different way of interpreting that metaphysics, I wouldn't go that route.
Okay.
Though you see, given Nassis's or Canassis's presentation of the metaphysics of the matter, that is a very good route to take, given how he sees things. I just don't go that route, because I'm thinking of essence and essay related to each other as act and as potency and act, with essence participating in essay. And so with that in place, then we have that act potency relationship, which is then subject to a causal interpretation. And so if we have some, it seems to me that a proponent of brute facts needs a set of strict criteria when to apply causality and when not to apply causality. And in the absence of that criteria is always going to be something that I'm going to interrogate. And in the absence of that criteria, I just need to throw it back to the brute facts defender to explain to me why we can't, apply causality here, but we can in other situations. And then once they give me their criteria, then, I'll hammer home at that. The Lagrange one is interesting because it seems to have a family resemblance to the Canassis' position, such that we seem to have a denial of an affirmation of a contradiction here, something, in potency and in act, and in the same way, in the same respect. Again, my sort of, philosophical kind of, opponents, shall we say, aren't, kind of the sort of rationalistically, the rationalists, the classical rationalists that Lagrange was going after. I'm kind of just trying to, kind of articulate what I take Thomism to be. And then if a rationalist or an idealist or somebody comes at me, I will kind of, defend Thomism by picking apart the metaphysics that they are coming at me with. Rather than trying to give that sort of, watertight presentation, which is sort of bulletproof against the rationalists and the idealists and everybody else that's going to come after it.
Yeah. I wonder if, let me see what you think of this. In a few minutes, I'm going to have to go here. But what do you think of the line of reasoning that looks at the unity of essence and existence and acknowledges that it is? It's a real state of affairs, right? There's an actuality. So, we could, I don't know how you would, what you would think about this, but the essay is that principle in virtue of which the essence is real, right? So what is it that distinguishes X from nothing? It's essay. It's the principle of being, right? Okay. But that essay and essence are united in X and conjoined. That's a fact, right? That's a fact of existence accounted by the essay, I suppose. But it's an actuality. So what about this? What if we would say that if the unity of essence and existence is in virtue of neither itself, the essence, nor an extrinsic cause, then there would be nothing to distinguish the real state of affairs of the unity from the non-real state of affairs of non-unity. So in which case there would be nothing to distinguish the real from the non-real. But if there were nothing to distinguish the real from the non-real, well, then the real would be non-real, or being would be non-being. So I'm just curious. What are your thoughts?
Carlo, remind me, was that Owens? Who was that pushed that first?
I'm not gonna claim it's original for me. I probably got it somewhere. I can't cite the source of where I got it from. I'm horrible at that.
No, I'm going insane because I remember reading that one time and thinking that's really interesting, but then I kind of dropped it. Now you brought it up.
But now that I have a legit Thomist in front of me, man, come on, bring it on. let me hear it. Let me see what you have to think about that line of reasoning.
So I run that argument, or something similar to that argument, in my 2015 book, Aquinas' Way to God, when I look at the causal principle, because in the De Ente, Aquinas articulates the causal principle. If something has some sort of characteristic, it either has it intrinsically or it has it extrinsically. And I address the issue, well, what if it doesn't have the characteristic intrinsically, but there's no extrinsic cause for it? And I run that sort of argument that you run, that you have these two distinct components of the thing which happen to be together. So what is it in virtue of which that they are together?
Amen.
That has to be some sort of cause. And so you can run the extrinsic cause from there. So I run that argument in Aquinas' Way to God. Now, interesting that you sort of brought that up, because if what you're saying is kind of like the argument that I run in Aquinas' Way to God, John Canassis criticized me quite a bit for that. So in that special edition of the Annals of Philosophy, which kind of looked at my book, John Canassis had an article in it in which he criticized that very form of reasoning.
Interesting.
Isn't that funny?
So John Canassis doesn't seem to be happy with that way of defending there being some sort of cause for the existence that a thing has.
Yeah, it seems to me what's working in order to defend that there would need to be an extrinsic cause if SA is not had in virtue of itself, of the thing itself, that we have to be able to defend the principle that wherever there is a union of diverse elements, right, there has to be a cause for that unity. And it seems to me this is what Lagrange is getting at in his God, his nature and his existence in volume 1, the 2-volume set of Lagrange, where he's saying that, you know, a brute fact skeptic position on this front entails a relation of agreement between terms which are in no way related to each other and have nothing in common which might constitute a basis of agreement. So you have two distinct elements, right? And there is nothing in either of the elements in virtue of which they could be united, but yet they are united.
Yeah.
So it seemed Lagrange is trying to push the idea that you have a relation in as much as they are related, the factuality of the matter. But in the brute fact skeptic position entails no relation because you're saying they're not oriented toward each other, neither in virtue of itself, nor in some extrinsic cause, nor either in virtue of SA itself. So you have to affirm a relation and no relation at the same time. So, so it seems that principle of wherever you have a unity of diverse elements, it necessarily requires an extrinsic cause to account for the unity of the diverse elements. Yeah,
I would go with the unity argument only so far as we're trying to account for the actualization of some potency, for why you have some potency which is actualized, so why act and potency are united in the thing. And in doing that calls for some sort of cause in virtue of which the actuality is present in the thing. I wouldn't want to sort of go any further than that into that whole question of relations and relationality. So, but that would just be my sort of disposition.
Yeah, what's interesting you brought that up because I inquired about this relation between essence and essay, that Lagrange speaks of, with one of my former professors. He was like volcanoes going off, right? What are you talking about a relation between essay and the essence? Because a relation metaphysically entails two substances, right? And we don't want to say essence and essay are two distinct substances. They're principles of a substantial being.
Right.
Yeah. But still, I mean, in Aquinas, he's got that analogical thinking. We can analogically apply these categories because we can talk about relations in the Trinity. And we're not talking about substances which are related.
Amen.
So there is an analogical application of these, and Aquinas is happy to do that in non-Trinitarian cases as well.
Right.
So that wouldn't set the volcano off with me. It would just be I would be more prone to thinking in terms of act and potency and deriving causality from that. That's kind of the way I would go, rather than Lagrange's way.
And so that basically brings up the question of why must there be something actual in order for potential to become actual?
Yeah, precisely. So once you get the metaphysics of act and potency right, I think everything else falls into place after that, which tends to be my strategy. So that if somebody wants to disagree with the argument, they need to disagree with the metaphysics of act and potency, rather than, come along and say, well, okay, we have causality here and here because we have dependency for actuality, but we don't have causality here because, well, brute facts.
Right. And so it's an arbitrary standard.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, let me just congratulate anybody who has hung on this long in the conversation. I mean, this is fantastic. I love this stuff because we're kind of deep in the weeds now, but let's zoom out, and I just want to try and get some perspective on this, because I think it's really important, because I really do think that the brute fact objection is probably the best objection you can make from the skeptical standpoint. And I think it's absolutely terrible. Quite frank. I'm just being frank. I think it's the best, and I still think it's terrible. And whether or not we can get that strict contradiction is something I'm going to continue mulling over with you, Karlo. I want to, and you, Gavin. I'd love to, because if we can, sweet. But I certainly don't think that we necessarily need that for all the other kind of responses that we've given. how it reduces to absurdity, how it's an arbitrary standard, it's special pleading. And once you kind of understand the underlying metaphysics of acting potency, yeah, it just becomes a little too convenient to suddenly start invoking brute facts for it to be taken seriously. I don't know if there's anything else you guys want to add to that, but I just wanted to kind of like zoom back out to try and get some.
All I got to say is thanks for nerding out with me on that.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, guys, because we've been going for a while, and Karlo, I love having you here. Gavin, Karlo, would you guys be up for making this a two-parter if we pause?
Amen to that.
Yeah, I'm always happy to come on.
Because we've covered a ton of territory. Gavin, I know it's late there. Karlo, I really enjoy your contribution. So if we could just, I know you got to go. Maybe we could just pause it here and then pick it up. We'll schedule off, off air. But if that's cool with you guys, I think it'd be great to keep
Thank you.
the conversation.
It would be an honor to be on with you guys again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful for the opportunity here.
So before we go then, Karlo, if you have a few minutes, let's just do some kind of like final summary thoughts of everything we've covered so far, things you want the listener to kind of remember, the key points you want them to remember and take away from the entire conversation. Because I know we did start in the shallow end. We got pretty abstract and deep. So
I always find it fascinating when you're looking at the metaphysics of the proofs for God's existence to see just how God-bathed the world is. And I get that imagery from Frank Sheed. I remember reading his book. He talked about the God-bathed world, right? So like just looking at the stone moving from my left foot to my right foot, right, is a window or a gateway through which I can begin inquiring about reality and arrive at God. So that the very movement of the stone itself in front of me is explained and accounted for ultimately by pure actuality, right, that we call God. When I look at the very existence of something coming into being, or the very existence of the cup itself right here and right now on my desk, that I know, given certain metaphysical principles, that cup doesn't have existence of its very self. And if that's the case, then I come to the conclusion that there is a source of existence, a first cause that has existence of itself, that gives existence and accounts for why that cup, why the computer, why you and me exist right here and right now. So that whatever I look at that has being is accounted for ultimately by the source of being we call God. And that's a very beautiful thing to come to realize, to see literally God in everything, not to be pantheistic and that God is in the tree, but when seeing the tree or the cup, I'm able to think of God as sustaining that being in existence and my own existence, which of course inspires gratitude. And to be able to share that truth with others and say, hey, you have a source of your own existence that you're radically dependent upon, and that there is an honor due to that creator, to give thanksgiving to that creator who is the source of my being right here and right now.
Amen. That's brilliant. Gavin, how about you?
Yeah. So, Karlo is, really just summed up the sort of argumentation that we've been through, so I don't need to repeat it. But it's just to go back to a point made at the start, we've well and truly left the cave. We've left the cave of shadows, and we started out, talking about, a hand moving a stick to move a stone, but all of a sudden, imperceptibly, we're on to thinking about the actuality of these things and, the source of actuality by which a hand could move a stick and move a stone. And so, it's as if we just started with the shadows and went straight out of the cave, into the life outside the cave. And that's kind of the way these arguments go, that we're starting with reality. We're not tuning in to any, specialized sort of metaphysical domain. We're starting with real things and thinking about them metaphysically. We're thinking about them in a certain mindset where we see that there are metaphysical categories at work. And if we could just think those through, we would get a metaphysics which ineluctably leads us to God. And that permeates our entire being in the world. Our being in the world isn't separated from our metaphysics. Our metaphysics kind of runs throughout our being in the world. And so as a metaphysician, we just kind of need to think that through a wee bit more, and we start to come to these sorts of arguments. And by the end of it, 2 hours, 2.5 hours into this sort of discussion, it's immensely satisfying to run these things over to keep them fresh in your head, so that when you return to the world is still wondrous, the world is still luminous, because you're aware, as Karlo was pointing out, there is a source for our being without which I, as the kind of thing that I am, the individual human being I am, would not be. And because that source of being is what grants existence to me, which were it not present in me, there would be something missing in me. It is more intimate to me than anything else could be in all of reality, precisely because were it not present in every fiber of my being, I simply would not be. Nothing else can be said about anything else that exists in that way. And so I'm most close to it in my just everydayness in the world. And that's something that we overlook, and we need to kind of be like Thales and step away from the everydayness and realize that that source of being is present throughout everything.
The mundane becomes wondrous, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm not going to try and follow up with you two poets here. Instead, I'm just going to give you a couple minutes each to make sure you plug the great work that you're both doing. So yeah, Karlo, where can people find out what you're doing? Where can people check you out? And then Gavin, same with you.
Sure. All of the work that I do here at Catholic Answers is at Catholic.com. But of course, because we crank out so much material in a day, all of my work is found in one location at my website, carlobroussard.com. If they're interested in the couple of books that I've written so far, one called Prepare the Way, Overcoming Obstacles to God, the Gospel, and the Church, sort of coaching you how to help unbelievers and skeptics overcome intellectual obstacles to the Catholic faith. And then my other book, Meeting the Protestant Challenge, How to Answer 50 Biblical Objections to Catholic Beliefs. They can get those resources at shop.catholic.com, or they can just go to amazon.com.
Beautiful. I will link that right in the show notes. Karlo, Gavin,
yes,
you've got some books out and doing lots of good stuff, so hook us up.
So I'm a lecturer at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. You can find me on the staff pages of St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. You'll get my email address, you'll get my office phone number. I'm also on Facebook. Add me on Facebook. You know, I'm not shy. I do engage with people. I'm on Twitter, but I don't use Twitter as much. I always promise to kind of update my blog. I never do because I'm busy writing books and stuff. But there is the Bearded Thomas blog, which I still need to add to. I just finished writing a manuscript of a book on the 5 ways. Pat's read it. And I've started a new project now, which is on the metaphysics of the resurrection. So that's
awesome.
Taking up my attention. I'm bringing some articles to completion on existential inertia, on the transcendentals, on the need for a metaphysical proof of God's existence. And if anybody wants to do doctoral work with me, if anybody wants to do research with me, just have a look at the programs we offer at St. Patrick's, get in touch. We do offer scholarships for doctoral studies. And, you know, get in touch and we'll talk about that. And finally, we have a big conference at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, next April, May, the end of April, start of May, which is going ahead. We have big thinkers like Eleanor Stump, Robert George, David Bentley Hart, John Milbank, Conor Cunningham, you know, Cyril O'Regan, Julia Klima, John Knassis, all those sorts of people, and me. So have a look at that. It's up on our website at St. Patrick's College.
Now, I don't know if this is a selling point or not, but I did buy my tickets, so I will be there. So we can hang out. We can lift some weights.
Yeah, we can hang out. We can have drinks,
chat philosophy,
get tattoos. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like an awesome time. Guys, this has been an absolute blast. I can't thank you enough, and I can't wait for part 2. Thanks a ton.
Thank you, Pat.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
It was a joy, Gavin. God bless you, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, Karlo. God bless.